17th. Happy to have everybody here. I would like to extend another warm welcome to our teacher representative, Mrs. McMenamin, and our student representative, Joanna Vines, the rest of our committee and our administrators and our solicitor. I'd like to turn it over to our administrator, Dr. Robarczyk, to give us some introductions and some administrative remarks after the introductions.
Yes, good evening, everybody. Tonight's agenda is pretty packed, but we should be moving through these policies pretty quickly. We have two that we're bringing back for a second time, policy 206 and policy 218.2. And then we have three new policies, policy 302, policy 610, and policy 250 that we're bringing forth for the first time with revisions. And based on this information and what we've included is on the agenda of why we're making changes to these policies. So you can refer to each of those agenda items that give a more detailed definition of why the policies are being revised or changed. And then we were on schedule, as you know, to bring policy 915 booster clubs to the committee tonight. Explained in a number of different publications. There were some meetings that occurred with Mr. Bechtold and Mr. Friel and those representatives for the parent organizations and booster clubs. And it was decided at that point, with the substantive changes that needed to be made, the revisions that were necessary to make to that policy, we decided that it would be better to bring forth that first draft of the policy at the May committee meeting. I'm also excited to announce that the AR for 903 communications is now complete and is posted on the website. And in response, we are going to look for a first read of rescinding 3 of those policies that are now included. That information is included in the AR, so they are no longer needed. And also, just an update in regards towards our goals and being current with our policies and ARs that are being placed on the website. Policy 251, homeless students, policy 810, transportation, along with their ARs are being posted, as well as soon to be the curriculum-related field trips for 903. That will be up on the website, hopefully by the beginning of next week. We're just working out some last-minute details in regards to the permission slips.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for those remarks. And at this point, let's move into public comment. Is there any public comment this evening? Good evening, Mrs. Sherry.
Since I, at the last meeting and you all were there, talked about the policy that I think you really need to have regarding privacy, that all data collected about students will only be used for educational purposes. I think that's really an important policy for this particular time. We did look at digital sports a number of years ago. I think it's time to revisit looking at digital sports and other groups, I don't know what they are, that may collect data about our students, just to make sure that we do the very best we can to preserve the privacy of the students. I mean, I was looking at the digital sports website today, and there's an area, I think, where, you know, if you're between the ages of 13 and 18, you have to get your parents' permission to either give information or access information. I don't think that students in that age group would necessarily, if they saw that, run to their parents to get permission. I mean, I think that's sort of been proven in other websites. So I'm hopeful that this committee will take a look at privacy protection for students, especially with the information that we supply to these companies. And the second policy that I'd just like you to take a look at, and I apologize because typically I would have run this off and not be trying to read it from my phone, but I happen to be looking at TE's website, and a policy that they have that they're bringing forward, I don't know if it passed or not, is called District Initiated Real Estate Tax Assessment Appeals. And I'm wondering if it would make sense for either this committee or the finance committee or maybe our citizens group to take a look at what's being proposed in TE to see if it would make sense as perhaps a revenue generator for Radnor. What it says is that it wants to authorize the filing of assessment appeals related to properties within the district. The procedures in the regulations specify that 1, all recently sold taxable parcels where a positive variance of at least 20% exists between the sales price and the implied market value based on the existing assessment will be reviewed. 2, the business manager will consult with the district's tax appeal council to identify the taxable parcels where the anticipated increase in real estate tax revenue for the district in the first year following a successful appeal exceeds $10,000, and where the expense of pursuing the appeal has a positive cost benefit.
Mrs. Sherry, excuse me for 1 second. Actually, our solicitor.
You're not like.
Our solicitor works with TE as well, so if it's okay in the interest of time.
You know, I basically finished. I'm not
Okay.
going to continue on this, but I thought, wow, a $10,000 opportunity for perhaps a tax parcel might be certainly worthwhile our time and effort and energy.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
duly noted. So we've made note of the policy you're pointing out, and we'll get information from him about the wording to it and everything. Thank you very much for bringing that up.
Roberta Winters, I was not going to speak, but having heard that, it reminded me that during the downturn in our real estate of the last decade, there were many parcels in Radnor that were reassessed at a significantly lower rate. It may be time to revisit not just the ones who are being sold now, but the ones that were reappraised at a significantly lower value that are now significantly worth much more.
Thank you. Keep doing that. We need a button that's right here. Thank you. That is duly noted as well. Is there any more public comment?
Cindy Spurtle. Thank you for the information on booster club policy, because that was one of my questions as to whether or not the meetings took place, and they did. Is there a field trip policy? Not yet.
Yes.
There is a field trip. It's a new.
Yes, it's curriculum-related field trips. We're just developing, finishing up the AR.
But I noticed the AR is not going to include not addressing any financing that goes to the
Correct.
committee.
That's been stated, that'll go to the finance committee. And they'll
Finance,
address
every time
that.
it's brought up, it says, well, can't get a decision yet on the policy. In other words, I've asked repeatedly about financing of the trips.
Right. We'll talk after the meeting. How's that? It's duly noted. Absolutely.
So if it's not going to be covered in the AR for policy, then
We'll,
how is it decided upon?
it's going to be a finance process as opposed to a policy, but we can talk about that later, because that's going to be the purview of the finance committee.
And the other question, just a curiosity question after all the policies that have been presented tonight, and the new trend or the decision was made that a lot of the bulk of the policy would be included in the AR, the ARs that are now being written. But the ARs do not have to be voted on by the board. If the board, is the board reviewing all of the ARs, making suggestions or further recommendations or approval of you don't give a formal approval. Is there any input on the ARs, which is a large portion of the previous policy, is no longer having to be approved by the board? How is that being handled?
Okay, great, good question. Thank you very much. Seeing no one else in the public, I assume public comment period is finished, and thank you all for your questions and comments, and we'll move into the approval of minutes. Do I have agreement from the board to approve the minutes from last month's meeting? Yep, terrific. Thank you very much, and let's move into policy 206, assignments within district. And this, again, is a policy that we have already done a first reading on. We are now embarking on our second reading, which will lead to adoption after it has its second reading next week with the full board. So with that said, I'd like to open up to the committee, unless there are any administrative remarks, any remaining questions, concerns, comments about policy 206 before we move it on. Andrew, would you like to? No, you're good. Susan?
I just have one comment on page, well actually it's a question and then a comment. On page 1, where we talked about under guidelines, it said, we were going to add in that sentence, in accordance with applicable law and accompanying AR, but actually, Ed, as I'm reading the last sentence of delegation of responsibility where it says the administration shall develop regulations implementing this policy consistent with the guidelines, that covers it for twins, right? That the guidelines about twins will be in the AR.
Correct.
Okay, great. Then the only comment I have is on page 2. The last sentence was just supposed to say homeless students will be assigned in accordance with board policy because it's referenced below, and we were going to take out the specific board, the policy number out of the text of the policy. So where it says in accordance with policy 251, it just should say in accordance with board policy. And that's, we discussed that last month. I guess I didn't see that.
That was, I saw that change. How this came back in, maybe we have to check our computers, but
No,
I do recall you saying that the change was made.
You are correct, and that was my error because I took out the name of the policy and left the policy number.
Okay, so
So,
with
but
that,
we're
I'm
just gonna
fine
put
with
board
this.
policy.
Good. Do we have any comments from our teacher or student representative on this policy? Chuck, do you have any questions on policy 206? I have one more member sent in a couple questions about this, so may I read those? In the first paragraph, the board member says that the old policy purpose referred to placement in, quote, classes and schools. The changes and the rest of the policy refer only to schools. She just wants clarification. Is that because there's another policy that already deals with placement in classes and, for example, between grade levels and within? And board member, I hope you're watching to get the answer. Upstairs. There.
Sure, so my interpretation would be when you look at 206, 206 is really a policy about assignment between different schools and attendance zones. If you want to think about specific classes, there's probably a class size policy that would talk about assignment to specific classes. The purpose of 206 is really to talk about different attendance zones and attendance zone exceptions, as opposed to assignment between specific classes within a school.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that, Ed. The next comment on policy 206 was in the 4th paragraph. It says, quote, designated for their attendance area. And the question was, should this be, quote, designated for his/her attendance area?
It's funny that you said it, because I actually thought it should have just said the attendance area. The attendance area was not incorrect, and that's why I think it said it. And it either needs to be the attendance area or his or her. I wasn't gonna bring that one up, but I did see it.
I think the is more in keeping with covering all the bases. So would that be okay with everybody to put the? Okay. And then the next to last paragraph, where it says, quote, requests for attendance area exceptions. This paragraph doesn't make sense to me. If a student moves mid-year, why would, quote, honoring such a request, end quote, ever, quote, require the addition of a class section, end quote? Class sizes are set at the beginning of the year. Why would a student staying in that class require an addition of a section?
Can I jump in? That's not about moving from one attendance. That's just a general, I have my student at one of the elementary schools, and for some particular educational reason, their needs would be better suited at a different elementary school in the district. And what that's saying is we won't grant that request if it would require the addition of a class size. What might make more sense is that paragraph should perhaps go, it should potentially go after the second paragraph in delegation of responsibilities, potentially. Hold although I don't know that it's there because it really is a guideline. But it follows along because I think that that is referencing when a parent or a family make a request for someone's educational, because it's best for their education program.
Just to be clear, are we talking about the second to the last paragraph?
Yes.
In the policy?
Yes, the last sentence, first sentence of that paragraph is the last sentence on page 1. Requests for attendance area exceptions.
Sure, so.
That's the paragraph in question.
Yeah, so that is correct, Stern, that this paragraph is not meant to be the mid-year changes. This is, at the beginning of the year, if you have a student at Wayne Elementary, they live in the Wayne attendance area, and they, for whatever reason, want a request to go to Radnor Elementary.
It might be less confusing if that paragraph were before the one that says students moving from one attendance area. Because I see why she said that. I happen to know that it was referencing just general requests, but that's what it's about. They're not related paragraphs. They're two separate
They're two
guidelines.
separate guidelines, correct.
Does the board have an internal way of referring to requests, general requests? Some districts call them transfer of attendance. Is there a name that you use to distinguish the two different types of exceptions that could be granted?
We do not.
No.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think so.
So it sounds like maybe, is there a way that we can clarify that? Either language or placement or something? Do you want to
Well,
noodle on that?
I
and come
think
back to us?
but I do think moving it up above that paragraph does make more sense, as Susan said.
Do
The
you think
request
so,
for
Susan?
attendance area exceptions.
Well, I mean, I can see, so because I knew from the get-go that they were two different guidelines, I didn't read it that way, but because the paragraph about mid-year movement talks about attendance area moves, I can see how you might misread that. I think it's clearer if the requests paragraph comes before the one that's basically a carve-out. So it's basically, this is how we make assignments, but the carve-out is students who move mid-year to another school within the district. And so it would follow that it should be,
Okay, so
the last
let's
one.
try that.
So
Let's
we'll
move
move
that
the
up,
paragraph.
and then we'll point that out.
Yes.
If Sarah does the change. Okay. All right, is there, let's see, did I survey everybody? Are we good? We've got our summary of changes there, Mr. Biasio?
Yes. And this can still move forward with the second reading.
Correct.
But do you want to quickly I'd like to, quick bullet point, what are the changes we're making again, just to make sure we're all on the same page?
We are taking the fourth paragraph, we're taking there and making it the attendance area. And then we're taking the paragraph request for attendance area exceptions and moving it above the students moving from one school attendance area to another. And then on the back, we are taking out 251 and adding with board, that it is in accordance with board policy.
right.
Okay. Sounds like a wrap on 206. It will move forward to the full board next week for approval. All right, thank you very much. Let's move on to our next policy.
Before we move on to
Yes.
206, we can also note that an AR for 206 is under construction, nearing completion, and the goal would be to get that posted at some point in time after the policy gets passed.
Correct.
Yep.
We are in a real AR policy rhythm now. Thank you so much for that. Appreciate that you're mentioning it. Okay, next agenda item is policy 218.2, terrorist threats and acts. And again, this policy has come before us today for a second time. And if there are any additional revisions, now's the time to make them, because we'd like to move this forward next week as well for its second reading and adoption. So I'll start to my left with Andrew. Do you have any questions, comments, concerns?
On my review.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move over to Susan. Do you have any?
No, it's good.
Chuck, do you have any?
On my review letter.
Okay. Okay. Joanna, do you have any questions, comments, concerns, ideas, dreams?
Just a few things. Is it on? Yeah. I don't know if this is, I didn't really look through this very thoroughly, and I don't know if this is like board policy board territory, but is there stuff about like enforcing or like new ideas to kind of like prevent events happening like from happening at school? I don't know if that makes sense, but like I just from talking to friends, like some people have said like, oh, we like should implement like metal detectors or things like that. Is this relevant to this policy?
Everything you bring up is relevant because you're a student and it's really an important voice when we discuss things. So I'm going to turn that over, I guess, to Dr. Robarczyk to address. I'm not sure necessarily that would go into a policy, but maybe we want to speak to the place in our district governance and administration where something like that could be channeled.
So what you have in front of you is more about when something takes place and how to address that piece of it. In regards to what you're talking about, I think that's more of that structure in the handbook and talking about those things, preventative measures, but also looking to the other resources within the district. So this is something, I don't disagree with you. We got to look to how to prevent, and there are discussions occurring also in regards to the student wellness policy of how we can look to, in the sense of preventing these things and the mental health issues as well. So.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And great, thank you, Joanna.
Yeah, great
and
question.
keep those suggestions
Yes.
and comments and questions coming. Really, when you say students are talking about, our ears perk
Yeah,
up. We want to
exactly.
know that. That's why you're here.
Did you have something else too, though? You said a couple things, or just with that was more looking at that
It was
focus?
more a question. Like I just
Sure.
wasn't really sure where that.
Where it fell.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And we may come across a policy where something like that is relevant once we continue to go through them, but for now, this is just, as Dr. Robarczyk said, how to respond to these things as opposed to prevent them. Mrs. McMenamin, any words of wisdom from the teaching ranks? No? Okay. I did have one thing that we had discussed some time ago that I just wanted to circle back to, and the question was that in the policy, the word designee was left out in 2 instances. And in the first instance, it was left out with regard to the wording, the superintendent shall annually report all incidents of terroristic threats to the Office of Safe Schools in accordance with the applicable law and regulations. Because we have become habituated in our policy writing to always say superintendent or designee, and it was left out intentionally.
Okay.
Because it is the superintendent whose signature is required on the annual report that is going for the Office of Safe Schools. So I just wanted to make sure everybody saw that.
Okay, great, thank you.
And the second one is the board directs the superintendent to react promptly and appropriately to information or knowledge concerning a possible or actual terroristic threat or act. And I said again there, designee is not present. And we decided to bring that forth for a little mini discussion here because Mr. Diazio had a recommendation for how we could change that wording. Do you remember that, or do you want me to read your explanation?
I believe my recommendation was to change the word the superintendent to all employees. Is that correct?
Yes, that was your
The
recommendation.
board directs all employees to react promptly and appropriately to information or knowledge concerning a possible or actual terroristic threat. And then the administrative regulation that is also nearing completion for this policy will lay out guidelines for staff at all levels in terms of what they need to do when they suspect that terroristic threat is taking place.
So I have a question / a little bit of a problem with that. So delegation of responsibility, the board directs the superintendent. And we don't have or designee in there.
Right.
So who are we, so my first question was, well, who are we directing if for some reason our is not available? So that was the first part of my question. Second part of my question, the problem with that language is that I am surprised that there would be an instance where the board would be directing the superintendent's employees. So I would be okay with the board directs the superintendent or designee to instruct all employees to react, to require or to compel. I think it's a little, for me, I think it's somewhat problematic that the board would be overstepping the superintendent and directing all employees directly. That would be a real change from our policies, and it would be a real change from our authority and as a precedent. So there may be some addition, and yet I think we have to put in some kind of designee, because the reality exists that if Mr. Batchelor weren't here, we would need to have, somebody needs to be directed, so there has to be a designee, I would think. And I understand that the notion of the superintendent shall annually report, you know, that's not something that's of a nature, if he's gone for a day or two, he can sign the report, and I understand that. So now I wonder what you think about what I'm saying.
So I think there's two different ways you can handle it. I think you can, as you mentioned, either put designee after superintendent, or if you want to soften the language about directs, you could put in a general statement to say the board expects all employees.
Well, so here's the
either way.
Here's the other thing, is that now that I'm looking at it, I'm so sorry, I'm realizing that, in fact, typically in a policy, we have authority, then delegation of responsibility, and then it seems to me, as I'm reading this one, that I'm so sorry, it's a train of thought that's dawning on me. The authority is kind of we don't normally have such a long authority. And as I read some of the authority stuff, it really occurs for me as guidelines. Why I'm saying that is that when you get to delegation of responsibility, I still would stand by the board directs the superintendent or designee to react promptly, blah, blah, blah. And that all these other things, the superintendent shall report annually, the superintendent shall be responsible for administrative regulations, and the board expects that every employee would react promptly. Those are all more like guidelines. And what's missing from this policy are guidelines. And I think some of the stuff in authority and in delegation of responsibility actually should be guidelines. Now, I'm not talking about changing substantively the contents of this policy, but the structure of it seems it's very different from everything else. And I'm so sorry that I didn't pick up on this in first read. So anyway, those are my thoughts. And I don't know if anybody else has some thoughts on this one.
The authority section in this policy could arguably be recategorized as a guideline section.
Well, that's what
and it could be moved after the delegation.
It's very long. You know, it's very long.
I think that's a fair point. And so if the committee would like, we can change the authority section to a guideline section and move it to the end of the policy following
delegation. But I also think, so under delegation of responsibility, you know, do you think the superintendent reporting the incidences and the AR stuff, isn't that guideline stuff? So, do you hear what I'm saying?
I'm not sure.
The second and third sentences under delegation of responsibility,
These two
also occur for me as guidelines. Not, the first paragraph is
delegation, correct. I agree with you, Susan. I think those two can be moved into the guidelines where it's the final steps of what the process is. So your superintendent shall annually report, and the superintendent or designee shall be responsible for developing administrative regulations.
We do though, Susan, keep, unless there's a reference elsewhere, I think we do need to have in our policy a statement that administrative regulations exist.
I'm not saying it would be a guideline.
Yeah, guidelines.
Oh, right, so, right.
It's just an odd spot. We don't normally have the...
So again, you're not talking about changing any substance to it, you're talking about...
Well, you know what, actually, we did it in 206 as well.
Usually the statement about the superintendent developing regulations, generally that's a delegation.
Okay, all right, then that's fine. The thing about annual reporting...
And another way to say the second sentence here to make it feel more like delegation, and I'm not suggesting that we change the language, but
sure.
This basically is like saying the superintendent shall be responsible for annually reporting.
Oh, yeah, no,
all
I get it.
incidents.
It's not,
So
it's not the kind of, it's still a delegation then, he's still responsible for that one. Yeah, I guess I would call a lot of that authority seems like guidelines, and it's somewhere in the guidelines where I maybe would have said something along the lines of all those other, you know, all employees are expected. I still don't think that the board should be writing policy where we are directly directing employees. I think everything should be going through the superintendent. That's just my, I think that's.
So I have it as, I think the last I captured was the board directs the superintendent or designee to instruct all employees to react promptly. Is that correct?
Can we back it up a little bit? Let's go to the top here and just make sure, because I'm a little lost. No, I appreciate your points, but let's just make sure we're on the same page given we're at the status of second reading, okay? So we have a purpose and we're all good with the purpose, is that right? I'm going down the list here.
Yep.
Purpose is good. Definitions, we're good with the title, the heading, and the content for definitions. We go to authority, and are we comfortable with that heading being in there at all? And if so, what content do we want to fall under authority?
Well, and I think this is kind of a question for you. What kind, the kind of stuff that we happen to have in authority isn't typical authority stuff.
The authority in this case is to react to terroristic threats. It's kind of the same authority that you'd have in a discipline policy. The board has the authority to set reasonable rules and regulations for conduct in school. You're prohibiting terroristic threats. That's the authority of what the board can do.
Okay. All right, so it could still stay then as authority.
It can stay as authority, or I think it can be presented as a guideline. I think it fits cleanly in both places. I think there's arguments that it could be either.
Okay.
So what would we like to do? We don't have any policies without authority sections in them for the most part, do we? Or, I mean.
Generally not.
Okay.
Is this one just unusual that it doesn't have guidelines?
The majority of the guidelines in this case, because they're so specific about who you're reporting to and things like that, are in the AR.
Okay.
Sometimes a board policy will contain very high-level guidelines, and then there's more specific guidelines in the AR.
All right.
In this case, the guidelines are so specific about what steps you're supposed to take when this happens, when to involve law enforcement,
Okay.
things like that, that it's all in the AR.
Okay, so let me pose this as a suggestion, so thank you. I don't think that anything we're saying is compelling enough to have us change the whole policy around, and I really appreciate that elucidation, and it is unusual to not have guidelines, but I think your explanation is very clear, so thank you. I would still suggest that we just leave the board directs the superintendent or designee under delegation of responsibility to react promptly and appropriately to information, and then maybe we put in the AR the whole thing about every employee is expected to
And that's it.
blah blah blah.
Yes.
Right. So because I do think that the whole notion that teachers and other employees are supposed to, you know, be doing those kinds of things are certainly covered in a variety of other policies, and I do think it would be. Yeah, so that's what I think. So, and so my only addition would be to say, direct the superintendent or designee, and I would be opposed to having the board direct employees directly.
Okay.
And now that Ken's back, maybe he'll have an opinion on this.
No, I just like the fact that I step out and I'm being directed to do a bunch of things. I apologize for having to step out.
No, you're doing your job.
Chuck, you have a comment?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments, and I think some of the confusion is because we changed the way we have our
They look
format
different.
here. And underneath authority, there used to be where we're getting it from before, and now it's after we read the whole thing.
Yep.
So that's where sometimes, because I always
Which
look
I
at
don't love.
Where, me either, but I'm just saying that that's where some of the confusion comes in, because we used to be able to say, this is how I used to read it, this is where we get our authority from.
Yep.
Over here. That's where the confusion came in. That's my one question.
Can you hold back and let's just answer that one before we move
No,
on?
we know the answer, it's in the board docs version.
Oh, I do know the answer.
Patty Calderoni answered this, because I brought this up last month. Patty Calderoni very clearly said what's great about board docs is that that authority is right within the text with a hyperlink to the authority. Just is gonna look different in the written version.
Right.
Okay, I like all the head nodding around
Yep.
the table.
Oh, no, Patty told us. You were great about that last
Oh,
month.
yeah,
She told
yeah.
us all about that.
Perfect, okay, I just
That-
wanted to get the head nodding.
That's just why I say, that's why we're a little confused on it,
Yeah.
But you're confused no longer, my
No,
friend.
I'm not confused, well, I actually knew that, but I'm just sharing that information.
It's a higher level.
Higher level.
We need a policy for that.
Now, my next question would be, what are the duties of the court-ordered reporters, such as all of our employees, or our employees? So,
Do you mean mandated reporting?
yeah, if you get a terroristic threat, you receive it, if you know anything about it, as a teacher, aren't you required to report that? I don't know. You're required to report certain things. I'm not sure whether they.
That fell under our child abuse.
Question would be whether that's
Fire.
child abuse.
Yeah, we have that in our child abuse policy, the
mandated
mandated
reporting, not that.
reporting protocol. It
No,
applies to that policy.
No, I do understand that, but what I'm saying is, court-ordered reporting, is that all it covers, or would not this be considered something that you should report?
Well, mandated reporting
Yeah.
deals with child abuse, and the
only-
definition of child abuse is pretty expansive. Could a scenario that somehow involves a terroristic threat maybe be child abuse? Under certain circumstances, yes, but it's very situational dependent. The terroristic threats, I believe, are required to be reported on the Safe Schools report. So if that's what you're talking about in terms of that mandated reporting, yes, it gets put on there. That's a report that gets put together with collaboration between the superintendent and law enforcement.
Okay, what I was kind of elaborating on Susan's point that elsewhere there are policies or regulations that we expect our people to report this. That's kind of where I was going. I was just curious of where that would be.
And in the regulation, we do say that any employee that has knowledge of or potential knowledge of a terroristic threat or of suspected terroristic threat is to immediately report to either their building principal or their immediate supervisor, and then principals and supervisors are directed to report to the superintendent.
And that's in the AR.
Correct.
Right,
Okay.
where the old language
That's good.
was staff members and students will be responsible for informing the building
And I
principal.
think the
Okay.
mandated
It's reiterated in
reporting-
the AR.
Gotcha.
The mandated reporting you were talking about stems from a different directive, from a different law,
From the
specific to
mandated
child
reporting.
abuse.
Correct.
I
So-
find it, as a teacher, for me, if I hear a terroristic threat, I would think, I should report this.
Good. You had good teacher training then. Okay, so at this point, we have one change to this, and it's to add the word "or designee" in the first sentence of delegation of responsibility.
Correct.
And that policy will now move forward next week for a second reading and adoption. Right, Andrew, do you have a comment coming in? All coming
I'm
together here late.
I'm reluctant to get us going backward here, but I just wanted to, under definitions, so there's great care under terroristic threat to elaborate exactly and be precise about what that constitutes. So there's 3 subparts to that. I'm wondering if under terroristic act, the definition seems quite broad. And I'm wondering if we could make it a little more precise by saying a terroristic act is a fulfillment of a terroristic threat. That way we are being precise without being redundant. In other words, we say an offense against property or involving danger to another person, as that is written, that's quite broad. But if we can just put in that part, that constitutes a fulfillment of a terroristic threat, then that, again, it adds some precision without being redundant. I'm wondering if that's appropriate or effective.
Sometimes when we have definitions, we pull them directly from code, statute or code.
Okay.
In this case, if it's not, and it's our wording, and everybody agrees, we could probably change the way we word that. What does the administration think?
I think that's a good point that Mr. Babson makes. It does appear that that's a broad definition, I want to go back and check the legal citation to make sure that that's not a specifically defined term. If it's not, and the committee's comfortable with it, I made the note as to what the recommendation would be. An offense against property or dwelling danger to another person that constitutes fulfillment of a terroristic threat. And I think as long as the committee's comfortable with it, that definition makes sense to me.
Does constitutes fulfillment of a, does a threat have to precede an act?
What if there's no threat?
We could add that,
You could add, yeah.
which may or may not.
You could still have the definition, your definition of terroristic threat, but you also could add in also fulfillment of whatever.
The crimes or actions specified above. You know, the idea would be to just avoid being wordy or redundant under terroristic act, and also while also being precise for the reader. Say, okay, this is exactly what we mean by it.
How about this? Could you noodle on that and send it to us prior to next week with
Sure.
send to the committee your interpretation of the suggestion here that fits? Obviously, we need to massage it so that it doesn't always mean a threat's involved. It could just be an act.
Right.
But it also is more specifically tied to the word terror.
Right, exactly. And I think there's a couple points there. I think as it stands, it's a bit too broad.
Okay.
I would agree.
So that's the direction here from the committee is that one word change for designee and second cleaned up definition of terroristic act. Okay. Great.
Just for a definition, for clarity from my point, you were somewhat directed at new. What exactly is that? The definition of it.
I'm gonna hit you on your noodles. Stop.
Oh, okay, I was just curious.
Okay, we'll talk later
I
about
don't
those
use that.
I believe
Alright, so-
you can look in the Urban Dictionary.
Oh, the Urban Dictionary, okay.
You're confused at a higher level.
I'm confused at a higher level, yeah.
All right, so let's move on then to agenda item number 3, which is policy 250, student recruitment. And as a reminder, this is being presented for the first time. And there are a few changes that have been proposed. Most of the changes stem from the Every Student Succeeds Act. We have to update our policy in response to the passage of that federal law in December of 2015. So some of the changes you'll see that reflect the content tweaks are a new title, and the guideline language is being moved into an administrative regulation. So, given that, does anybody have any questions upon review of 250?
Go, let Andrew go first.
Andrew, do you? You want to noodle on it?
I shall be noodling.
Okay. Susan?
Yes, I do.
Okay, Susan has some questions.
Someone who's 2 boys, you know, got this stuff because they're boys. I do. So,
May I just, before you start, so that people who are watching or whatever and don't have the
Sure.
materials know the name of the policy we're working on.
Sure.
It was called student recruitment. The proposed new title is recruitment of students by military recruiters, post-secondary education representatives, and prospective employers.
thank you.
You're welcome.
So, I don't recall, I recall getting the paperwork at the beginning of my boys, I guess it was their senior year, but maybe it was their junior year, asking about this. Did we, basically as parents, were we going to allow the district to give their names to military recruiters? That was my recollection of this. So I guess one of my questions is, were parents of girls given the same information? And I don't know because I never had a girl in the public schools. Because I always thought that that information was about recruiters, military recruiters. And this seems to expand the policy that now there's going to be all sorts of regulations or potential limitations, or you have to opt in to, you have to be proactive in not having your child's name given to a military recruiter. But the post-secondary education representatives, they were never part of this before. Like, so this is at a very high level. I'm not really sure what changed in the law that is that's driving this, and I am thinking, because I'm not positive how it went with girls, Amy, you're gonna have to walk me through this one.
Okay, so why don't we do that? Can you tell us what exactly ESSA directed us to change?
So, can I just answer the first question? Yes, because I actually had a conversation with the school counselors over at the high school, and every student their name is provided, girls and boys.
To the recruiters.
To the recruiters.
Thank you.
So I did find that.
Okay.
So in terms of legally what changed, the change was very minor. And previously, the parents had the authority to opt out. What the new ESSA says is that if the student is 18 at the time when the notice goes out at the beginning of the year, asking parents whether they want to opt out, then that right is the student's right to opt out. And that's consistent with FERPA. So all FERPA rights transfer to the student, from the parents to the student at age 18, and the change to the ESSA is simply now consistent with what ordinarily we would see in FERPA.
Okay, but I don't ever remember receiving anything about post-secondary education representatives and prospective employers. It was only ever about military recruiters. So why is this policy becoming much more expanded?
The regulations that are in effect about what information recruiters are entitled to have, nothing has changed in terms of what post-secondary representatives can have versus what military recruiters can have. It could have been that under previous practice, approval was sought in different forums, and now we've kind of put that all in one letter that goes out, but none of those rules have changed. The equal access provisions, none of that has changed.
Okay, do you guys follow what I'm saying? I have no distinct memory that anyone made a point of saying to me, as a parent of a student at the high school, could the college representatives have my kid's name? In fact, the colleges get their names based on how they do on SATs and ACTs. But I specifically remember getting this paperwork specifically about military recruiters, and I don't have a specific memory about prospective employers.
So, Susan, if I'm correct, so is a pivot point here, that second paragraph under authority where it says in accordance with state and federal law?
Well, that's what I'm saying. You guys are saying this is a minor change, and I'm going to...
What is the state and federal law?
Because I'll be curious, let me just jump in there for a minute. So, did we revise the piece? The law requires us to disclose, to give the parents the opportunity, or the 18-year-old to not. The law requires us with the military recruiters to provide that information.
Correct.
Wait, say that again?
The law requires us as a school district to provide the list of our students. All right, but to give an opportunity for parents to opt out, we are required by law to provide that to military recruiters. The law does not require us to provide the list to secondary institutions or jobs or anything. So your question is you think in the previous policy, Susan, if I understand what you're asking, was the secondary institutions part of this? Is that what you're asking?
No, it's more that...
the post-secondary institutions, I thought.
It is. It is about it's about both. So let me try again to say this. If it already existed that the military had the same right to be granted access to the students' names as secondary education representatives and prospective employers, okay, fine. I'm just telling you as a parent, I don't recall ever getting the option to opt out of prospective employers and post-secondary education representatives. I do recall getting the option to opt out of military recruiters. And so my concern here, ironically, is I see that this law is somewhat making the point that military recruiters have the right to have the same access to the kids as colleges and employers. Which, you know, that's probably, it sounds like that's law, Ed, yes? And that what changed in law is that if a student is 18, they have the right to either opt in or opt out on that one when the notice goes out. Okay, so maybe that's a change in the law, although there are other things in our policies that do not change once a student's 18, because there have been other policies we've discussed that the student being of age didn't change it. Medication being a big one, because this conversation came up in the medication policy about parents having to sign off on forms and things like that, and I said, well, what about if the student's 18? And nope, it's still, when the kid's a student, they're a student. We have this conversation. But what I'm surprised by is that the military doesn't balk at school districts that give their parents the option to opt out of their kids, the military getting the students' names, but we don't give that option for post-secondary education representatives and prospective employers. I'm surprised the military recruiters don't balk at that they are the only ones for whom parents can do an opt-out, at least that I recall. Now maybe my memory is all off, Ken, and I'm certainly willing to go by that.
And I guess the question, and I can't remember from my memory, and Ed, I don't know if you know this, but this is going back to the noodle. Maybe we need to noodle this one a little bit more and go back and check. But is the law that we require, if we're giving things to secondary institutions, then we must do the military, or is the law that we must give to the military regardless of what we're doing to secondary institutions? So if we as a district said we just don't share any information with any secondary institutions, then we don't even have to have parents opt out of the military? That's a further question that goes along with this in a second.
I want to make sure we're not getting ourselves into a situation where we are still being biased against the military recruiters.
Right, sure.
Both in notification and opportunities to opt out or not opt out. And it may come down to, Ken, exactly what you're saying, who we're required to give this stuff to versus who we're not.
So I pulled up the federal regulation here just so I could see it more clearly. What the federal regs say is that upon the request of a military recruiter or an institution of higher education, the district has to disclose the name, address, and telephone number of the students unless the student or the parent has opted out. Now,
Okay.
it could have been previously that the active opt-out process was only advertised, so to speak, for the military sharing. And if you opted out of the military sharing, that may have been, viewed as a complete opt-out. We've clarified that in the new draft. We've actually drafted, Tony and I have drafted a letter that the high school will send that complies with the policy of the AR. So if the letter was not right before, it will be now.
That's good to hear. All right, so you hear what I just want to make sure it's consistent.
And I am going to check with the high school to see if there was any approach whatsoever to the other piece when, prior to this policy, if they gave the opt-out for post-secondary education as well.
Okay, well then I'm going to say, based on what you just said, Ed, then the second paragraph that discusses authority, it says, in accordance with state and federal law, the board shall permit the disclosure of information. That's not really what our authority is. In accordance with state and federal law, the board shall provide the information when requested. I mean, we're not going to permit it. We have to provide it. So our authority's actually changed if you're saying that the law's changed. Shall permit means we will allow. Having to do it is a different piece of language.
Sure. So this can say, in accordance with state and federal law, the board shall disclose. Yep.
So
information about secondary students as outlined in the company administrative regulation. And that's where we explain the whole opt-out process and refer to the letter that will be sent.
Good with all that. On the very last paragraph, because I'm on the blue line version, under delegation of responsibility, number 1 says advise the district, the notice shall advise that the district routinely discloses names, addresses, and telephone numbers of students to military recruiters and representatives of post-secondary education to the extent required by law. Okay, so that's It is a required because we're required. I was gonna ask you if it wasn't allowed, but it's a required. All right, so number 2 doesn't exactly make sense to me. We are all, same thing, under the delegation, and that we're gonna explain the parents' and students' rights to request that the student information not be disclosed without prior written consent. Oh, so that's an option, is that you can give it, but not without prior written consent. So there's kind of 3 options. Either you do nothing and your name's gonna be given out. You can have a request that the information can be given out, but not without prior written consent. And then the third one is, you can just completely opt out for all things. Is that it?
Yeah, well, I think number 2 is meant to say, even if you opt out, so even if you get this letter at the beginning of the year and you opt out of those communications, if at a later time there's different student information that you authorize the disclosure of, we can disclose that. I think that's kind of what number 2
Okay,
says.
I think this is gonna have to go, you guys are gonna need to, we're gonna see this
Well,
again for a first read is my guess.
That's fine.
And then I would say number 3, establish a procedure for how the student or parent may opt out of the disclosure. I don't like the word can, it's a may. And then it's legal references, right? We don't use the word citations, or is there a particular reason why this says legal citations?
As opposed to references.
As opposed to references, yes, thanks. It's the very last thing.
I think it was put there because it was all legal, there's no other board policies or anything, so we can change that.
Oh, no, it's fine. So then, I guess, and this is an AR question, but I don't really need to get in the weeds about it. You are gonna make it specifically clear where parents could opt out for employers and military, but stay in for post-secondary, or opt out of employers and post-secondary, but stay in for.
Correct. There's
Okay,
going to
there's
be
gonna be a
automatic
menu of
choice.
options.
Yeah.
You check on the.
Check
And
on
boys and girls get this.
Correct. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm done, sorry.
No, that's good. All duly noted. So just to recap your comments, Susan, we're changing references at the end. The authority in sentence 1 is changing to the board shall disclose. And on page 2, are we changing any, the only thing in sentence number 3, we're changing the word from can to may?
Yes, and number 2, I think Ed, under the authority, Ed's gonna look at the wording for number 2 to make it clearer.
Delegation of responsibility?
Yes.
Okay, make clearer. Okay, Mrs. McMenamin, do you have any feedback on this?
Yeah, it's confusing.
It's very confusing.
Yeah.
Okay, Chuck?
It is confusing. I've been noodling over here, but anyway. So what we're saying is, can you opt out of the military? We're saying we can. So, but in here we're saying in accordance with state federal law, the board shall disclose the information about secondary students to representatives. Should we not somehow, this is saying we're going to disclose all this, right? Okay, and then you're going to have to get to the outline of the company administrative regulation. But when I read this, it's just coming to me like you're going to disclose this information, and you have to continue on. We're not going to disclose it because you can opt out. Unless you opt out, we're not going to disclose it.
So this letter to parents is gonna have to be very clear.
Right.
Basically, we need a very clear letter so people understand, oh, we are required to give it, but you can opt out.
Correct.
Okay.
Which even in that state confuses. We're required to give it, but we don't have to.
Okay, and Chuck, do you have anything else?
That's all I have.
Okay, then again, we have a comment from another board member in the first paragraph, just to clarify. We don't control access to students except through the district, and we information, only access to the information about them which we hold. It would be better if the purpose were clearer on this point. Do you understand what's meant by that?
I'll read it again.
Yeah, I could.
How about we, it'll go for a first, do you think we can do this for a first read? Yeah, next week? I mean, we're just
If the-
changing.
If the committee's comfortable, I think it can still move forward.
Right, okay.
Unless the committee comes
Let's
to a
do that and
different
have that
conclusion.
the person who authored this question, maybe state that at the meeting so that if we need to change
Okay.
she can speak to it better than I can.
Okay.
All right, so let's move on then. This will go for a first read. And the same thing, maybe you can send to the committee your reworded number 2 under delegation of responsibility ahead of the meeting, just the way we're doing the other one ahead of the meeting, so the committee can take a quick look. Okay.
Before we move on,
Yes.
can I ask one question?
Sure.
So we've looked at 206 so far, and we've looked at 218.2, and just so that nobody's confused, we used legal references in 206, we used references in 218.2, and we used legal citations. So what is the language?
References.
References. And we will update them all.
Yes,
Okay.
references.
Right.
Thank you. Good question.
Legal references or just references?
I think just references. I mean, because we have board policy, which
It
isn't
doesn't matter.
really a
That
legal
covers all.
reference.
Yeah.
Is everybody comfortable with
Yeah,
references?
that's fine.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Let's be consistent with all our policies. I think all our policies might say, we'll just look to check this.
We will.
Right, right, okay. I like consistency. Thank you. Next agenda item, policy 302, employment of superintendent and assistant superintendent. Again, this one changed as per the school code being updated in November. And the revisions in this policy relate to the amount of notice a board must give its superintendent and/or assistant superintendent regarding contract renewal decisions, and the default provisions that go into effect if the board fails to take such action. So those are the changes that you'll see in this policy, as reflected in the blue-lined version of it.
Red line.
Red-lined.
Red line, blue.
Sometimes it's red, sometimes it's blue. Does anybody on the committee have any questions? It's pretty straightforward what needs to change here. It went from 150 days notice to 90 days notice. And then you'll see in the red line what the default action occurs if that deadline is not met. It's pretty much straight out of code, is that right?
Correct.
So, does anybody have any questions? Andrew, do you have a question? Nope? Susan?
So I was actually surprised, because that's what that's what I thought were the changes. There's actually other changes in here. I was a little bit surprised. I would tell you in the first paragraph of purpose, it should say the board places the primary responsibility and authority for the administration of the district with the superintendent, not in the superintendent. Is this notion of 3 to 5 years a term, is that a law thing that we can't, it has to be at least 3 and it can't be more than 5? Okay, great. This very long sentence, the 1, 2, 3, 4th paragraph, that's a super long sentence that I'm good with. There needs to be a couple of commas in there to make it make sense, or it needs to be broken up a little bit differently. It's very difficult to follow that paragraph. And
Just to clarify, I want to just understand better what you're saying. There are 3 sentences in the red line. It's 1 paragraph, but the red line consists of 3 sentences.
well, but it's pretty long. The second sentence of the 3
Yes.
is pretty long.
Okay, so is that the one that you'd like us to,
Yeah,
if the board
second-
fails?
if the board fails, yes.
We want to break that up.
Well, no, not break it up, just read it carefully. I think it needs a comma after the word terminate. It was long. I do have the question of what's the difference between an acting superintendent and a substitute superintendent?
One of those, the acting superintendent or assistant superintendent, is when there is no existing superintendent or assistant superintendent. A substitute superintendent is when your superintendent or assistant superintendent exists but is out on leave.
Oh, okay, thank you.
What would you think of adding a definition section for that?
I don't think that it's
No?
substantive, I just was curious. Under guidelines, do we need, oh, okay, it's fine. So it says, the board shall actively seek candidates, blah, blah, blah. It may be aided in this task by. I don't understand why we got rid of the word and. I know why we got rid of the word or, but a committee of board members. and the services, and/or the services of, so how come you got rid of the and/or after the committee of board members? Is it not required to have a committee of board members?
I just think the and/or belongs at the second to last bullet point in any given list.
Okay, got it, thank you. And I really do think that was pretty much, yeah, that was the only questions I had about that. So we're required to have a committee of board members. Board members have to be involved. So I guess that's where my question is. So we're required to have a committee of board members to select a superintendent.
When you have a search for a superintendent or an assistant superintendent, it's
Mhm.
completely within the discretion of the board as to how you conduct that search. This is a may provision. So what this basically is saying is the board can act as a whole. The board can delegate that responsibility to a committee of the board to screen
Okay.
candidates.
Nope, that answers my question. We're not required to use a committee of the board.
Correct.
The board could decide just to use the services of a professional consultant.
Correct.
Thank you, I'm good.
Okay.
Is this something we see happening, or is it?
No.
Andrew,
Not
do you
for
have
many,
anything?
many, many,
Do you have
many, many, many,
anything?
many years.
Andrew, did I ask you already? Okay, so with those changes,
In the interest of expedition,
yes,
I defer comment.
okay. Thank you for your deference. So we're gonna change the with in the first paragraph into with. We're gonna come up with an alternative sentence for if, in the bottom red line, from if the board all the way to for a further term. Can you send these all back to us again, please, before the end of the week? Is that doable? Do you think, I wasn't really kidding, I was wondering if we should add a definition of what an acting superintendent, in case somebody has that question at some point,
I don't, no.
Okay.
Picture of Tony Costello.
Yeah, that's right. He's our go-to guy.
We have a plaque for him. All right, so, that will move on for a first read.
And we'll adjust the reference language at the end.
Oh boy, I didn't even look at that, thank you. And last but not least, procurement.
Can I just ask a question about this one? The format that this is going to come back at is going to be the board docs, right?
Yeah.
Not going to be this.
Correct.
Right.
We're waiting until we get through the second read.
Okay.
Then it will be transferred over to the
Gotcha.
new board doc.
Next month, it will
Next
still
month.
be in this format.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
once that's through.
Okay, and the last one is policy 610. Again, this change was driven by, I'm gonna turn this over to Ed, because it's about thresholds, and it happened in January of 2018, and that's about all the detail I have on that. I'm gonna turn it over to our legal expert.
Sure, so every year the Department of Labor and Industry releases standards with thresholds for when contracts and purchases are required to go out to competitive bid, or where price quotations are required to be sought. So when we decided to look at 610, the goal was to simply update the dollar thresholds. But as we got into it a little bit, realized that a lot of the language, those dollar thresholds really belong in the administrative regulations, so that every January 1st, the board doesn't have to come back and make a change just because the threshold has changed $100 or $200. A lot of the language in 610 is not different, but it's been rearranged and moved around. And with this one, as I look through this again, it's most of this language has been moved to the administrative regulation. And if the board wants to see that at some point, we can certainly share that. But most of the language is not changing. It comes right from the school code as to what you're required to get bids for.
All right, so Susan, do you have any questions?
No.
Andrew, do you have any questions? You still expediting over there?
So there was
Turn your
something
mic.
that,
Your mic.
there was something that
Caught your eye.
that Sarah and I chatted about.
Okay, go for it.
And so there was discussion about delegation
Mhm.
and business administrative, let's see.
The board delegates to the business administrator or designee
Right.
the responsibility of establishing and implementing a procurement framework. That's the essence of your question, because I see it here
Right.
with Sarah's note.
Sure. So, does the framework, I guess a question that I had in that discussion was, does the framework need to be put up for board approval as well? Or is that just a delegated responsibility to the business administrator or designee, and we're fine with that?
Would you say that again?
So there's language in here. Let's see. Or the board delegates to the business administrator or designee the responsibility of establishing and implementing a procurement framework as outlined in the accompanying AR, gives us the guidelines below, et cetera. Okay. So I guess being still relatively new to this process, I'm still getting a sense of what is appropriately delegated to administration and what is appropriately the purview of the board. So the way that I read it here is, just to be clear, is that the creation of this framework, procurement framework, is solely the responsibility of the business administrator or designee, and that the board has no direct purview over that. In other words, there's no need for the board to directly approve that framework development process.
Correct.
Okay.
All right, but the board could review it.
Could review it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's funny that you say that. The wording is a little bit, the wording of this particular delegation is a little bit different than some of the other ones. And it's one of the unusual ones, I think we actually talked about this back in 2016, that is delegated to the business administrator and not to the superintendent.
Correct.
And it's by code. It's all by school code.
Okay.
This is it's very different. It's probably one of the few policies that's written this. The 600s are the place where you're the most likely to
there's a
see
few in
this.
the 600s
It's the 600s, it's the finances.
And I'll add to that, part of the framework is the guidelines that are specified at a very high level. So part of the procurement framework is not splitting purchases. That's one of the guidelines here, so as to avoid the bidding thresholds. Part of the framework is to ensure that, with kind, quality, and material being equal, the lowest responsible bidder should be awarded the contract or the award for the purchase. So the board is setting very high-level guidelines. What's mainly in the regulation is the dollar thresholds, and those dollar thresholds change every 12 months.
Okay.
All right, so I guess consensus here, we're moving this for a first read next week as well. And I don't think there are any proposed changes to this one, except you have their legal references.
Yep,
So,
I have that circled already.
so we just have to make that consistent and then we're good. And we'll update those little boxes
Yes.
in the upper left-hand corner where we're keeping track of versions now, if you notice the little nice rectangular boxes. And with that, we are moving, this is a quick mention. The last one is that we are asking the board to put the board leadership and the superintendent to put on the agenda the rescission of the 3 communication policies that are no longer needed now that we have the communication policy administrative regulation. And just, I was not aware, but it has to go through 2 reads as well. So the first reading towards a rescission will be this next week. And with that, I would say new business, but our new business candidate left. And I would say public comment, but the public left. So with that, I say thank you all and see you again soon.
We're adjourned. Are you off?
Not yet.